Thank you. Okay. So, so welcome everybody, and I'm really happy to be here today. Especially happy to be here, but it's not an accident, honestly, that I chose to be on day 2 with technology the way it is. But one thing that's really impressive here is how the Katisal team has risen to the occasion. I saw somebody in the chat box who wrote that. I think risen to the occasion is really the correct terminology here. So today's topic I'm going to be talking about is vocabulary, vocabulary, and vocabulary. And let me just say up front right now that for those of you who don't deal with academic vocabulary, for example, you might be in adult ed, or you're teaching first or second graders, for example, or it's just a conversation class. Vocabulary is important to everybody who's trying to learn a language. So I hope that you'll be able to take away some of the ideas that I'm going to mention today. The whole purpose of today is to give you 3 ideas, 3 suggestions for using word lists to teach academic vocabulary. But again, I think what I'm going to say today is going to be relatable to all kinds of word lists for all kinds of purposes, whether it's academic or just English conversation as well. All right, so thank you to the Katisal team, especially Susan, Marsha, Margie, Leah, Nancy, Amy, and who else did I forget? I don't know. That's always a danger of giving a list. And to the other people who moderated. I can't tell you how nice it has been to attend a conference from the comfort of my home. I'm here in Florida, and just be able to soak in things as I wanted, in the order I wanted, and take breaks when I wanted, to be honest. So it's been a really good event. I don't know of other TESOL events. For those who aren't so familiar, I speak at many other events, and they've been canceled or they've been postponed. And to see Katisal, to see any organization step up and be the first one or the second one to do this is just amazing. So kudos to the Katisal team. I don't live in California. I'm in Florida. I have no connection to California. I've never taught there. I've never worked there. I joined Katisal in 97 or 98 and haven't looked back. A lot of great people. Just a really good organization here. So thank you very much for this invitation to speak today, and especially on the topic of vocabulary. So the 3 suggestions I'm going to give you today have come from my most recent book, which is Academic Word Lists, What Every Teacher Should Know. But in this book, it talks about different word lists that are available. And that's the first question to pose to everybody is, can you name a word list? Can you name a word list in general? And can you name an academic word list? I'm not using any of the poll features today. So this can be done in the chat area, or just in your own head. Can you name a word list? So I want to talk about why we have certain word lists and why those word lists might be better than others. I hope what you take away today is going to be 2 different things. One is going to be which word list might be most applicable to you and your teaching situation, and within that, why some of the lists that have been in our field for 20 years now maybe aren't the best list for us to be using. It's strange because for the longest time we had no lists in our field. I know it might be hard to believe, but vocabulary was a bad word. Grammar was a bad word. Anything that was teacher-centered or the teacher was in charge of the class somehow was relegated to the back of the pile. And now we teach vocabulary and we use different word lists. And one list in particular has really taken off. I want to give you alternatives to that. The second part of today's talk is to give you 3 suggestions for using whatever list it is that you're going to have for your students. So usually what happens in my talks is I spend way too much time talking about the importance of vocabulary. But if you've shown up here today, I assume that you also appreciate the power of vocabulary. At this point, what I usually do is think about stories of people who studied a foreign language. Because if you studied a foreign language, and I don't mean you just took Spanish 1 20 years ago and you know how to say taco, tortilla, and where's the bathroom maybe, and beer. Cerveza seems to be a word everybody learns. It's just that if you actually tried to function in a language, did you actually, so I lost the slides here, sorry. Did I do that?
Oh, I can get them back for you.
Oh sure, yeah. So yeah, sorry. So yeah, so that when you're in that foreign language and you had to function, as a person who's been through 6 different foreign languages, I have never thought, oh, wow, I really wish I had past perfect progressive today. How do you do this in past perfect progressive? No, what I didn't know was what's the verb for arrive? What's the verb for purchase? What's the adjective for interesting? I don't know how to use those kind of words. It's been vocabulary, vocabulary, and vocabulary. So many famous quotes within our field, but the bottom line is that without vocabulary, you just can't go very far. You can have limited grammar and get by. I'm not an anti-grammar person by a long shot, but I'm saying if I had to spend time on one area to help students improve their English ability, regardless of whether you're doing academic or not, it's going to be vocabulary for me. And I say this as a language teacher and as a language learner. So, this slide came out interesting. So increasing your vocabulary, I'm going to argue in favor of what I call the 4 E's. Extensive exposure to language in listening, reading, and real-world tasks, and then explicit effort through instruction, word lists, and mental effort. So I'm going to talk about these without going on to a different slide right now, but listening and reading, I think that's pretty obvious. I think about the different languages that I've been able to study and learn and function in, and my best one by far is Spanish. So with listening, I spent in real-world tasks there, I spent hours and hours and hours at the lunch table in the cafeteria, in the dormitory when I was in college, not with my Spanish teacher, but with students from Honduras, Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, trying to understand what they were saying. And that interaction where I was in a real world task, I really want to know what you're saying. I really want to participate in this conversation. And then with reading tasks, early on, this was way before email when I was learning Spanish, but I used to write letters back and forth to people. And I had to read this real letter, which didn't have a glossary, okay? It was real reading for a real purpose. So extensive exposure to that. A side note here, I know we have heard a lot in the past about the natural approach and why explicit attention to anything might be a negative. Explicit attention to grammar, reading, writing, vocabulary, pronunciation is not a negative, is definitely not a negative for me as a language learner at all. Natural approach works fine. All of us are products of the natural approach as we learn English or Spanish, whatever our first language was. But that's because we had 18 plus years or 12 plus years or how many plus years to figure it out and be involved in that. And my students don't have the luxury of time or this natural exposure. So how can you speed this up somehow? This is not first language learning. This is second language learning or third language learning. And you need explicit attention to some of these things. So when I say explicit effort, I mean you don't pick up a language accidentally unless you live in that place for 10, 15 years, which is the first part, the blue box on the left-hand side. My students, many of my students are in a theoretically an ESL environment. So I'm here in Central Florida. I'm sure what I'm going to say is very similar to wherever you are right now. But when my students leave class here in Central Florida, in theory, they're surrounded by English. In reality, they're surrounded by all their friends who speak Spanish or Haitian Creole or Russian or whatever their first language is. That's normal and natural. That's what is really happening out there. So you don't have the luxury of time, 12 years, and you don't have the luxury of extensive interaction, extensive exposure. How do you compensate for that? Well, it's more than compensation. It's a way to speed this process up, I think, and that's explicit attention. So I have instruction, word lists, and mental effort. I want to do the second and third ones first. The word list is what I'm going to talk about today, the power of vocabulary and why you need hundreds and thousands of vocabulary ideas, units. I'm saying vocabulary units because when I talk about vocabulary, most teachers think about individual words like the word dozen or the word giraffe. No, it's phrases like a dozen eggs or a dozen donuts, that whole chunk, if you will. Or it has come to my attention, that whole chunk is not a combination of it plus has plus come plus, no, it has come to my attention, it has come to our attention. Research suggests that is a common chunk that you will see in academic writing, okay? So those chunks, each one of those counts as a vocabulary unit or word or whatever you want to call it there. There are word lists for words, and there are word lists that include phrases, and there are word lists that include idioms, and there are word lists that include chunks or collocations as well. Mental effort. You really have to want to do this. You need to keep a vocabulary notebook, for example. You don't accidentally keep a record of all the new words. What I call it is training my students to become aggressive vocabulary hunters. I'm going to teach a lot of words in class, but I can't possibly teach you all the words you need. You need to do a lot of this on your own. So in class, I'm going to cover important words. That's why I use a word list. That first one where I say instruction, most people would equate instruction with a teacher in a class instructing you or a computer program instructing you. There's actually another component that a lot of people don't give much attention to, and that is what happens inside your own head. Now, what do I mean by this? So my Spanish is pretty good, actually, but I still receive a little Spanish lesson every day from the equivalent of dictionary.com in Spanish, where they give you a word a day and they give you 2 sample sentences. So a lot of times the word might be something very disappointing. Like today's word is giraffe. And I think, oh my gosh, giraffe. Why is giraffe the word of the day? That makes no sense for me. So the giraffe, and I know the word giraffe, jirafa. I know the word giraffe, and I know it's feminine, so it's la jirafa or una jirafa. I know all of that, but when I read the sentence, that word giraffe will be, maybe it'll say something like, the last one was, in fact, among the many animals found on the savannas of Africa is the giraffe, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, oh, this word savanna, I didn't know what that word was. And among, it wasn't the among that I knew. For example, between you and me or among us, it was a different word. My point is, every day I get those 2 sample sentences. I dissect those sentences to heck and back, okay? Because I'm an aggressive vocabulary hunter and I need to improve my Spanish. So if it's the word adjacent, for example, I learned the word adjacent, but in Spanish, if you have the word adjacent, what goes after adjacent? Do they use something? Because in English, you have to have the word to. If you have the word adjacent, it's always adjacent to, right? So my point is that instruction can be from yourself, where you're actually teaching I hate to say teaching yourself, that makes you think you're doing the whole course on your own. I'm just saying you need to be a person who notices language to the nth degree. Those are the people that are the better language learners.
Hey, Larry, what's up?
Hey, have you guys had a student over the years, for example? I'm sure you may have had a student, you thought, wow, this person, she's really good or he's really good. And why is that person so good? Well, I think one reason that makes them good is this list, that they have mental effort. They're really trying. They're not just going to class and being and existing. They're doing the homework. You have to go beyond that. They're using word lists or something with vocabulary. The better language learners have a certain set of strategies. There's not this is the best strategy for, period. That's not what we find when we look at what the good learners do. But the good learners have a plan of some kind and they execute that plan. That's what they do. That instruction part is really crucial because the better learners, in my experience, are people who will analyze something not too much, but they will notice things like, oh wow, adjacent. Every time they say adjacent, it's always adjacent to. Or along occurs with along with what you said, it's along with. They notice those kinds of things. So for me, when I receive that Spanish lesson every day, that's what I notice. Again, the 4 E's, extensive exposure through all those ways you're seeing on the left-hand side, plus explicit effort on your part, because I'm the teacher, and even if I taught you 24/7, I could not possibly teach you all the words that you know. So the first thing I want to talk about is word lists are bad. Oh, please. This is in a book I did called Vocabulary Myths, it's one of the chapters that I dissected to look at what the research really says. This is not what I think or you think or what a student thinks. You interview 10 teachers, 5 might say I like lists, 5 might say they don't like lists. I don't care what anyone says, and you don't care what I say. I want to know what research says. And the research is really clear on this. Research shows that word lists aren't bad. What's bad potentially is what you do with the list. Saying that word lists are bad, it's like saying whiteboards are bad or Zoom is bad. Well, yeah, Zoom is bad if you do it 5 hours a day. We're all very familiar with that right now. But there are aspects of Zoom that are really good if you use those certain aspects judiciously, right? And in an appropriate manner there. So word lists are bad. No, I often heard this in my graduate classes and from other teachers as well in the 80s. In the 80s and 90s, early 90s especially, I heard this a lot. Word lists are bad. Translations are bad. And as a person who was functioning or starting to function in language number 5 or 6 at the time, I kept thinking, really? Because I have a word list and I translate words. I don't just translate. I don't learn that giraffe is jirafa and stop. So if I learn the word jirafa or giraffe in English, I've trained myself. I stop and ask, is that a word? Okay, I know what it is now. Is that a word that I'm ever going to use? Probably not. If I did use the word, why would I ever use that? Because I want to make reference to something that's tall maybe, or I want to make reference to something that's in Africa. If I'm explaining something about the land in Africa and I want to say something about animals that live there. But the point is, it's going to be something like I see a giraffe. So every time I learn a new word in Spanish, even in my head, I'll say, I'll say in Spanish, I see a giraffe, or there are 5 giraffes, or I saw a giraffe at the zoo. I try to imagine how I would use it, not in this massive, big context, but in a nice, short little phrase. So in Vocabulary Myths, a book that I did back in 2004, there's a whole chapter in this book that talks about the research showing that word lists are not bad. This book is organized around 8 myths, and one of the biggest myths is that word lists are bad. I think that in 2020, we're actually most of us don't believe that word lists are bad anymore. I think that people see them as being boring, and that doesn't speak about the quality of the list. That speaks about the quality of what you're doing with the list, right? That's like saying that that the gym is boring. No, the gym is not boring. What you do there might be boring. Don't confuse the two. A list isn't bad. So I want to talk today about different ways you might use these lists. Because we're talking today about academic language, academic vocabulary, I want to talk about what you think academic language might be. In a moment, we're going to give you guys a chance to test out your ability. This is the interactive part. We'll let you test out in 3 tasks. We'll let you test your ability to find academic vocabulary. But let's start with a definition. So what is academic language? Well, there is no standard definition of this. And in fact, if you don't believe me, when you finish this session, or since you're on a computer now, just Google academic language in quotes and see what you get. You might get different articles about it, but if you ask 10 people, you'll get 11 different definitions. It's not very clear, so I'm just going to go to one definition I found by Jim Cummins, an expert in second language learning here, who defines academic language as the sum of vocabulary, grammatical constructions, and language functions that students are going to encounter in the materials that they need to function in a school setting. So we've got 3 things: vocabulary, grammatical constructions, and language functions. So the grammar part and vocabulary part might make sense to you, but the language functions, I'm going to say what I think one of those functions might be. So for example, in an academic setting, my students go to office hours. Now, if you're in a junior high or high school, this may not be the same for you, but well, let's go to something different that's everybody can relate to. Your students want to send you an email to ask you a question. How do you start that email? What's the function is to, your language function is to start the email and not sound weird or strange or rude. But I'll have students that will start off with, hey, my name's not Hey. I don't respond to hey. Dear Keith, I am not Keith to anybody that I'm teaching in a class. That's unless at a graduate level, maybe. So there, we teach students how to go about doing this. Or I was going to say with office hours. Office hours, if you look at that as one language function, it's not an hour long. An office hour actually lasts about 15 minutes, right? 10, 15 minutes, ask a question, get out. You need to come with a specific question. So vocabulary, grammar, and language functions, all of those combined. Today, I'm talking primarily about vocabulary, but I will talk about grammar a little bit too. So here's your test, everybody. I'm going to give you 3 chances to see what you can do here. I'm going to use not something that I wrote or you wrote or a student wrote. I'm going to go to a real academic passage. So I chose 3 passages from academic materials, and I want you to find the academic words in these passages. And I will start. I'm going to have a test here. See if we're the smiley face or the sort of smiley face here. So here's your first one. This is from the academic word list. Can you find the AWL words here? Part of the land acquired in the Louisiana Purchase, Arkansas became a separate territory in 1819 and achieved statehood in 1836. The term Arkansas was used by early French explorers to refer to the Quapaw and the river along which they settled. The term was likely a corruption of that word, comma, the word applied to the Quapaw by another local indigenous community, the Illinois. So I'll give you guys about 30 seconds there. What would you say are some of the academic words here? And if you look at the words that are popping up, you see that we're getting different words. Now, here's a clue. Let me help you out so everybody can. So when you're doing, this is a little bit of a learning activity for all of us as a speaking activity. When you give students or give participants a task, People respond better. People feel better if they know how many answers there are. And I will tell you right now that there are 4 AWL words here. There are 4 academic words in this passage. Does that impact the way you answer this question? Give people maybe another 15 or 20 seconds to type in what you think some of the words are. I just want to read what people are typing there as well. So I see someone mention tiers or levels, and that's true that if you are a K-12 teacher, K-12 teachers often talk about what they call tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And for those who aren't familiar with that situation, so in the academic ESL, intensive English courses, college courses, we tend to talk about general vocabulary and then academic vocabulary. And then, of course, there are words like Arkansas or Quapaw, which is these proper nouns. Proper nouns are not going to be on anyone's list because that's very specific to whatever the subject matter is. So if you think about tier 1 for the K-12 group, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Tier 1 is super common vocabulary words. In the higher ed situation or adult ed, it's what we would call tier 1 would be the first 2,000 words of English. Also on a list called the GSL, the General Service List. So the first 2,000 words for everybody are considered tier 1 for K-12, or they're considered general vocabulary for the people who are not K-12. And then K-12 talks about something called tier 2. A lot of those tier 2 words are words that we would call AWL in higher ed, as are some of the tier 3 words. The problem I have with that label of tier 2 and tier 3 is there is no standard definition of that. There's no word count for it. There's no, when words are a certain frequency. Tier 2 and tier 3 appear to be based a lot of times on intuition. And when you have intuition, then we have a problem for me as a person who does word lists. I'm not saying that teachers can't make their own word list. More power to you. People are busy. Teachers are super busy. So what I'm saying is a word that you might think is common, like book and pencil and paper, is not a common word outside of schools. So tests and students and education and learning are not super common words there, all right? So, by the way, here are the answers for what I just gave you. I killed enough time for you. Acquired, purchased, achieved, and community are these. The academic word list, April Cox said 2000 is sort of the standard in our field today. I use the AWL for today's activity because the AWL is the one that's most known in our field for academic language. And I'm going to talk at the end about why I would agree or disagree with some of these. So those are those 4. Let's see how else you can do. So here's the other one. So can you find the AWL words here? The ADEA forbids age discrimination against people who are age 40 or older. It does not protect workers under the age of 40, although some states have laws that protect younger workers from age discrimination. It is not illegal for an employer to favor an older worker over a younger one. I'm really happy to read this, thank you. Even if both workers are age 40 or older. So I'll give you a 30 seconds or so. Can you find the words here? How many do you think are here? So I see people saying I didn't get the answers right. And that's my point, is that this is all being done very individually. And it goes back to the fact that there's not a common definition of this. And what we're proposing people who make lists is that this be based on frequency and where the words occur. And I'll talk about that a little later. Maybe, I'm hoping in the Q&A some of these will come up as well. So I will tell you that there are 2 AWL words in this list. I would have chosen more, but my opinion is worthless because we're looking at, now it might be a word that my students might not know, but it doesn't make it academic. It makes it a word that my students might not know. So 2 words. All right, that maybe is enough time there. What do you think? All right, I'm looking up to the side. I see discrimination a lot, illegal, protect, forbid. See, forbid is a word my students wouldn't know. I would have to teach the word forbid. All right, answers are the word, there are 2 of them. Discrimination occurs twice, and the word illegal. And so I personally would have chosen other words. So, for example, look at the word although. So although is one of those words that might come up as tier 2, I think in the K-12, I'm just guessing here, tier 2 setting, although is you might say, well, that's a common word. Yeah, but it's not one of the first 2,000 words. It's not as common as the word but. I don't, when someone asks me if I want to go get a sandwich, get 3 tacos at the restaurant down the street, I don't say, although that sounds like a really good idea, I think I'm going to wait, unless I'm trying to be funny or a little distant. You know, I wouldn't use the word although like that at the front of a sentence, especially. All right. So it's only 2 here. Let's try one more here. So those who know me a little bit, I'm a fanatic about several things: tennis, tennis, vocabulary, grammar, and the aurora borealis, the northern lights. And so this is a picture of me. I'm not sure, it depends on your computer, and you can see the green behind us here, but the aurora borealis 2 years ago. Throughout the ages, since we can't travel anywhere now, we have to reminisce. Throughout the ages, the lights of the aurora borealis were believed to be messengers of gods, signs of apocalypse, or souls of the dead. Even the most sophisticated scientists misapprehended their cause. Now, Lucy Jago tells the story of the science and the romance of the Northern Lights as she traces the adventure of the life of the visionary Norwegian scientist Christian Birkeland. So, what would you guys guess to be the AWL words here? So Christina made a good, really interesting comment. Christina, I hope you'll ask that question about, you said your students knew the words community and illegal already, and that's an important point. And then someone asked about the AWL words, where they come from. Well, the AWL words are, again, in the book I explain all of this, but the academic word list is freely available. If you Google AWL, and don't just do AWL because you'll get all the tools from Home Depot, but you have to put in AWL vocabulary and you'll easily find word lists there. And there are ways to use those lists and there are ways not to use the word list that I'll talk about in a moment. But I will tell you here, everybody, there's only one AWL word here. And that word is traces. Traces. And that's a hard word to explain because, of course, you have trace with a pencil and then you trace something and then it traces back to where no one traced anything, right? So my point with this is to show you that it's difficult for teachers to agree on this. And this is why I yield to people who make word lists, but not just any word list, but I want a list that's based on science and not. If you Google right now the 100 most common words, check those lists and see how much variety there is between the lists. There shouldn't be any variety. The 100 most common words are the most 100 common words. Now, you might say, well, it will depend on what you check. It will depend on what you check if you use small batches of language. But when you have something like the Corpus of Contemporary American English, COCA, which has 560 million words of language in it, if you get another big corpus, say of just history books or just science books or just cookbooks, I'll bet you'll find that your list is still pretty similar because you're using such a large sample there. All right. Let me show you one of grammar as well. Let me go back to this one if I can. I wanted to show you a grammar point here. Notice, I'll spend 30 seconds here. I want to show you how academic grammar looks. So let's start this week again. Part of the land acquired in the Louisiana Purchase, comma, Arkansas became a separate territory. What's the main verb? The main verb is became, and the subject is Arkansas. Arkansas became. What is this chunk in the beginning? Part of the land acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. Well, that's actually what we called in a positive. It's a noun, part. That part equals Arkansas. We don't speak using appositives. We don't say, someone says, hey, Keith, can you tell me a good restaurant where I can get some really good tacos? And we have this, it's called the Mexico Place. And I would say, well, an ideal restaurant located at the corner of Bumby and Curry Ford, comma, Mexico Place is a wonderful, we don't speak like that. We don't speak in appositives. So the term Arkansas was used, blah, blah, blah. The term was likely TERM. Some of you named that as one of your AWL words. I would explain the word term. My students wouldn't use the word term. They would say the word. Well, term is not the same thing as word, is it? Term implies something that's a special usage here, as this word is. But my point is, there's grammar within this as well. That's not the topic of today's talk, but since our definition had talked about language functions and grammar and vocabulary, I wanted to address all 3 of those. All right. So leaving those, we start talking about word lists. how many word lists are there? Well, when I did this book and I was trying to compile different word lists, academic language only, because outside of that there are many more, I came up with 35 that I found, and plus, because what's really disheartening is when I write a book and then someone sends me another article where there are 2 more word lists out there, and I think, wow, that's a really good word list. I wish I had known about that before. But at least 35, and I always say, how many can you name? Most people can name just one, and the one they can name usually is the academic word list by Averill Coxett in 2000. The AWL is widely used. I've used it a lot. I think it's a great reference tool. The AWL has many limitations to it. Well, I should say several limitations to it that are very important limitations. I'm only going to address one right now, and I saw somebody who, I forget the person's name right now, who said that her students already knew the word community, and then the other word, whatever it was, I forget what the word was right now, but that's a good point. So the AWL, one of the big problems with it is that it's based on a word family, where if the word productive was the most common word, productive, the adjective was super, super common, you'll find this word family where you've got produce, product, produces, products, productive, productively, production, unproductive, unproductively, and we give students this pile of 9 words to learn. I think that's a mistake. I'm not against helping people learn word forms, don't get me wrong, but what was the purpose of a word list? It's a word list, not a grammar list, not a language list. It's a word list. If the most important thing of the list is to help students with vocabulary, then I want to know productive, or if unproductively, that's not the one. But if that is the most common one, then that's the one I should use. So I would say if you're going to use the AWL, and I explain this in the book, the AWL is always presented in 4 different ways. And one of the ways it's presented is just with the most common form. And those are often in italics. Those are the forms you want to teach. You shouldn't be, in my opinion, I don't want to know the base word. I may never use the word product. Then you might say, what's a good word to learn? Your opinion and my opinion are not what matters here. If you're trying to teach academic language, academic vocabulary, and we as Averill Coxett has done and others have done, we get millions of words of academic language together from textbooks, student papers, PowerPoint presentations, university lectures. We put all those words together and produce a list. That's the list. Well, I don't agree with the list. Well, good for you. This is not about whether you agree with the list or whether I agree with the list. The list is the list. So one of my main beefs with it is that the AWL was developed in New Zealand. That's not the problem, because it used a wide variety of language, sort of. The AWL, the students that people are teaching in New Zealand are mainly Asian languages. So you have a lot of Chinese speakers, Malaysian, Indonesian, Japanese, and we don't have a lot of Spanish speakers there. So that's a problem for me, because what if you look at the AWL list, which has 570 words on it, how many of the AWL words are actually cognates in Spanish? I say Spanish because the last stat that I saw was that across the board in the United States in a K-12 setting, 78% of ESL students are Spanish speakers. So roughly 4 out of 5. So 4 out of the 5 speakers. Here in Florida, it's a lot higher than that. Maybe in California, I'm not sure where you are. Oregon, I saw 2 or 3 people from Oregon or Washington. It can vary a little bit, but across the whole United States, it's 4 out of 5 are Spanish speakers. So yes, it behooves us to ask this question. There are 578 AWL words, and how many of them are cognates? So you can have true cognates, partial cognates, false cognates. And a student of mine years ago, Robbie Bushong in 2012, his thesis at my university that I supervised was the academic word list reorganized for Spanish-speaking ESL students. So we look at Spanish-speaking ESL students, how many of these list words are actually similar to what's happening in Spanish? Now you might say, but they don't know how to pronounce the words. You know what? When I'm in an academic setting, I don't have to pronounce a whole lot of things. Mostly what I do is I go to class. I teach in a university setting. I'm not teaching ESL students. I'm teaching a teacher training course for English speakers, right? These are undergraduate courses where they have to read a textbook. They're reading a textbook, not out loud. They're going to websites, not out loud. They listen to me lecture. That's listening. The pronunciation might matter. But in terms of speaking, my students hardly ever speak. I have 61 students. I can put them in groups. They might speak to each other. But the point is, I don't know that being able to pronounce these words is the most important thing if we're talking about vocabulary. So just pure vocabulary. Now, again, if you're teaching kindergarten, K1, 2, 3, they don't know the words in Spanish, let alone English. I get that. But if you're teaching high school students who speak Spanish, or university students, as mine do, or the people in an intensive English program who speak a language already, having a cognate matters big time. So what percentage of these words do you think are true cognates? What did Robbie find when he did his study? Some percentages there. I see someone guessed 70%. Any other guesses? I agree. Pronunciation helps in comprehension, but the first time you comprehend a word is probably going to be in reading. The number one, think about reading, writing, listening, speaking. What do you have to do in an academic class to survive? You have to read. I can go to class and I can't, my listening's not so good. I can borrow somebody's notes. I can ask somebody who speaks Spanish or English, whatever language I speak, to tell me after class what happened. But I'm going to have to read. I'm going to have to write at some point. But the academic language in writing, in written work, may be somewhat different than the academic language in textbooks. And almost all of these corpora are based on textbooks. Very few are based on student papers. That's another one of the problems. If we take these academic word lists and tell our students, you need to write with these words, that may or may not be true. People haven't really investigated that, to me, enough. Well, the answer here for true cognates is 76%. Sorry, the slide moved like that. But roughly, what do we have? So roughly three quarters of the words, and only 2% partial, 3% false cognates. And I think it was, 10% might be, I can't read the number down there. That might be false cognates. But if 3/4 of your list is already reasonably known to a Spanish speaker, then when I teach the word community, and I think how much time I'm going to explain on the word community when you're going to say comunidad. He said, well, it's not exactly the same. It's enough the same, or it's the same enough in order to help the student grab what this means and keep moving, right? Again, we can't spend the whole class time on 3 words here. Other academic word lists. I'll let you read through these really quickly. I'm going to present only 2 slides here with 5 or 6 on each slide. How many of these lists have you ever seen, or have you ever heard of before? I knew the academic formulas list. I was familiar with that. The academic keyword list is a pretty cool list. I didn't know about that one. The collocation list I had heard of. The other 2 I had not heard of. So here's my second slide, my last slide, because I can't do all 30 something of these. There's the academic word list in Cox had in 2000. The one I would like you, if you're only going to go look at one additional list, I would recommend one of the 2 above this one, the academic vocabulary list, the AVL, because the AVL is not based on word families. The AVL, the academic vocabulary list, it's the single most common form. And if it's the same part of speech, they might give it. So you have the word productive, they might teach you unproductive, but they're not going to teach you productively, and they're not going to teach you production or product. So the AVL does 2 things I think better than the AWL. The AWL looks at the form. If P-R-O-D-U-C-E, again, P-R-O-D-U-C-E, which can be produce, the verb, and produce, what you find at the supermarket in the vegetable area, right? So in the AWL, those 2 things would be treated as one product, because it just searched for letters. But the AVL is based on part of speech. So production and productive would be treated differently. Productive, I'm just going to make these numbers up. Productive might be word number 500, and production might be word 800. They're not going to teach you at the same time because they're not as useful to you at the same time, right? So having said that, our 3 suggestions here, 3 ideas for using these words. Whatever list you're going to pick, the first thing is, this is suggestion 3 in the book. So the book gives 10 different ideas. Suggestion 3 is never attempt to use the whole list. I see this all the time. I see teachers who will send students a link to a list of 570 items, or a link to 87 items. What do you do with these 87 items? That's what the teacher's supposed to do. So if you're not going to teach the whole list, and I don't recommend teaching the whole list, point students in the direction of the list, go over what the list is, introduce some of those words there, and then give students strategies for using the list. All right. And in the book, I talk about that. I'll give you 2 others in a moment. But the first thing is a teacher strategy. Don't give students the whole list. And when you find students who say, oh, teacher, I found this really great list, and they show you the list, then you might want to talk. This is teacherese, meaning do this. I'm saying you might want to tell them, means tell them. You might want to talk them out of doing this, because that leads me into my second caveat. My second suggestion is, when you learn words, that AWL has 570 items. That's way too many items at one time. The creator of the list did not intend for anybody to attempt 570 items at one time. So if you're going to use a shortened list of 10 items or 15 items or 25 items, whatever your magic number is going to be, then what I would like you to do is choose words that don't look alike or sound alike. So earlier, someone said something about knowing the sound of the word is important for remembering vocabulary. That's true, actually, because when I learned Japanese, for example, I know a lot of Japanese words that I can't write because I don't know the kanji for all of those words. So the word for cat is neko. If you show me flashcards, I can find neko, but I can't write neko. But if I hear neko, I know what it means. All right. So it was frustrating that I would hear a word in class and I couldn't write it down. I was writing it down in English, but I couldn't write it down in Japanese. So when I went home that night, I had nothing to study except my Romaji, my Romanicized, my Roman lettered version of what I had done in class, right? Make a smaller list. Let me show you how this might work, everybody. So 2 versions. So on the left-hand side, we have analysis, approach, area, assessment. I'll let you read that list. Those are just grabbing 12 words from the list. Now, they're not, that's not exactly an alphabetical, that's an alphabetical order, but I took out some words. So I didn't just grab the first 12 words of a list. I actually pulled some out and created this list here. Now, what's the problem with that list? How many words start with A? I've got, 7 words that start with A. When people learn a brand new word, or anything new, I would argue, when you learn a brand new word, that new item is competing in your brain for other things that you already know that remind you of that. And so it's easier to learn something that's a little different. It's similar but different than what you already know, as opposed to learning, for example, 2 things that are exactly the same at the exact same time. But my favorite example is from level 1 ESL, kitchen and chicken. Kitchen is a place, and chicken is an animal or some kind of meat. The point is, they're not the same thing. But because students learn kitchen and chicken at more or less the same time in their English career, and kitchen, look at the sounds in kitchen, kitchen, 4 sounds, and chicken have the same 4 sounds, just reorganized. So kitchen and chicken, they're both 2-syllable words. They're both stressed on the first syllable, and they look alike and they sound alike, and they're kind of related. Food, kitchen, I get it. So that's a recipe for disaster, okay? So when you give students words to learn, if you have to teach this whole list at some point, whatever you're teaching, you might not control the list, but you control which chunks you teach and in which order these words are taught. Please give your students chunks of vocabulary that don't look alike or sound alike. So on the left-hand side, you might say there are 7 A's, 2 C's, 1 E, and 2 F's. But I also look at over here, the word number 4, assessment. Number 10, environment. I've got 2 ment words. That's not good for me. I've got authority in number 6. I've got community in number 8. That's not good for me either. I've got 2 ITY words. Final and focus, start with an F, 2 syllables, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant. Disaster. There's final and focus have no connection in terms of meaning, but that's going to cause a problem potentially. So I would rather have things that look different whenever I can. And my last point today is, when you're first trying to learn a word, the very first strategy I teach my students to do is look at the word and ask yourself, do I know this word already? If I know this word, do I know it kind of, a little, or do I really know it? If I kind of know it, is it a word I think I've heard or a word I saw? Did I hear it? Was it listening? Or did I see it? Was it in reading and writing maybe, all right? Was it on the teacher's, on the word wall somewhere? Was it on a website? Where did I see this thing, right? What's my connection to the word? Or, yeah, I know this word. I just can't say it out loud. There are a lot of GRE words and SAT words, right? Even for native speakers. I see one of these words. I don't know how to say that word. I know what it means. I don't want to say it out loud because I've never heard anybody actually say that word, which tells me it's a word that we usually see in print as opposed to something that's almost always there, all right? So what you want to do is something like this. Here are the 12 words we're going to practice, everybody. Here's my list that I've made for us today. We go from A to V, right? And you don't find any duplicates there. There are some long words. There are some short words. There's only one plural word, that's variables. There's only one ANT, significant, one shun, that's legislation. And then data, a little short word. I would ask my students first, look at these 12 words. Which word looks the weirdest to you? Which word do you think maybe is not even English? Which is so strange it might not be English, like xylophone. or something like that, right? And they might say occur. Well, why occur? Because it has the two C's together. Okay, that's not learning the word, but I've drawn your attention to the word. And that's my first step, is to get you to go, I've seen that word. And this is the practice you do. Analysis. You have your words. I'm going to try to divide the words into three, if they're using little cards, into 3 stacks. You could also do this if you have this on a Word doc, the words at the top, and you just take the words out and move them to the bottom, or copy and paste them. I don't know, I kind of know, and I know. So I might say analysis is something, I don't remember. I think it means something like studying. That's kind of know. It's not study, but I'll put it in the yellow pile for now, all right? And the next word I'm going to use is going to be the word concept. What about concept? Oh, concept, that's an idea. That's the green one. That goes in the no pile. And then the next word is data. What about data? Data, that's just a weird word. I've seen it. Data, data. I don't even know how to say it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. So my point with this is I teach students to regulate their own learning, because I can't be there. Remember I said earlier about the effort? You need mental effort. This is your mental effort. You need to go ahead and do something with these words. This is something that students can do. And that concludes my very quick presentation. And I think I've left the time for the Q&A. I hope I did.
Hi, this is Marsha. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if my mic is working.
Yeah.
That was wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for your knowledge that you're sharing with us. We have lots of questions, and we can probably answer a few of them today. Yeah, otherwise we could take whole long courses together with you. One of the questions is, can you speak about how to retain vocabulary?
Sure. So questions about how you retain vocabulary. So most textbooks or most things people would say, you need to recycle the words. That's really easy to say, isn't it? So what I do with vocabulary is that last thing I showed you with the flashcards, where I keep recycling the words through. Knowledge is not static. People's knowledge will change over time. So something that you taught somebody one day, or something that I taught myself that I thought dozen means 12. What a weird. Okay, dozen. It's in my head, right? I looked it up and I did it myself. So if it's a word I think I might want to keep, then I write that in my vocabulary notebook, and I'm diligent about reviewing my Spanish notebook or my Japanese notebook. I have a Spanish notebook that I do now, Marsha, where I keep notes about these kinds of things. That program I told you that sends me a word a day. The word a day is not the big takeaway from that. What's the takeaway for that for me is studying the words around the word away. So with building knowledge, sometimes I'll see a word like adjacent, but I never paid attention to how adjacent was really used. So when the word is called out to me and I can study adjacent to, or what's before or what's after it, that's one way. So
I guess you're saying to us then that we should be as aggressive in learning vocabulary as Keith Folse. All right, guys? Yes. Teach your students to be really aggressive learners, really very highly motivated in this way. We have another question from somebody from Brazil. She says that there's some new research emerging on lexical approach. What do you think about the lexical approach?
So the lexical approach is actually not so new. It's actually people are rediscovering this. This is Michael Lewis, I think, for around 1988, 89, 1990. So the lexical approach, I remember going to presentations at conferences and thinking, what a cool idea, because what I like about it is vocabulary is at the forefront. So instead of trying to organize your syllabus around grammar points, which I think fewer and fewer people work that way, although there's still a grammar syllabus in the back of everybody's mind here. It's the idea about words for doing X, or words for talking about science, something like that. So lexical approach is where vocabulary becomes your #1 goal. And for example, if you're going to practice prepositions, it might be adjacent takes to, or instead takes of, or similar takes to, right? In favor, I keep using of once. I'm trying to get something different here. Interested in. So if you're going to teach prepositions, or you really want to teach prepositions, do it within a vocabulary lesson, if you will. Now, let me say one thing. A lot of times when people think about vocabulary, the way that these lessons get organized is by something called a lexical set. And what they'll do is they'll teach you all the kitchen words, all the food words, all the color words, all the days of the week. And research has been really clear that this is not an effective way to do it. Now, I know I studied Spanish that way. I study French that way. Your students probably have English textbooks where we teach the days of the week. All 7 days of the week are in lesson number 5, and lesson 6 is all the clothing items together. And that is one way to approach it. It's the convenient way to write a textbook. But when you study, you're reading a passage and it says, Maria packed, she was going to Norway to see the Northern Lights, and she packed a blue wool sweater. You now have the lexical chunk of blue wool sweater, because wool collocates or goes with sweater a lot. What's the value of learning wool all by itself? Wool sweater is probably how I'm going to use that word, or it's made of wool in that chunk, right? That phrase. So instead of teaching all of these words by lexical chunks, lexical sets, we embed them. We take the phrases, the big lexical phrases, and embed them throughout the whole book, right? Lexical approach, I think, is a really good thing. As we move away from such a strong focus on grammar. Grammar is not bad, but without vocabulary, you're not going anywhere. I think it's the single most important thing you can do for students at any level, vocabulary.
Well, that is perfect. And I think that really blends in with another question, which is really about, without, an argument that without context, individual words and phrases aren't remembered as well, right? So deep learning really occurs when the words are used in context and you have these chunks or phrases that are useful to the learner. That's another thing that you've talked a lot about. The vocabulary has to be useful to the learner for the learner to have that motivation to get that aggression, to learn more about how the words used and in what context and all the words around it. Yeah, wouldn't you say so?
Yes, I mean, 2 things. First, words in isolation aren't bad by themselves. But whenever I learn a word, I don't try to learn the word as giraffe. I never learn jirafa and stop. In my head, again, that I was saying earlier, explicit instruction can happen in your head. Every time I see a word and I think, interesting word, I want that word, I stop and see if I can notice what's around it to get the phrase it's in. I don't want a huge context. Context doesn't need to be a whole paragraph or a story of your life. It's just the word before it, sometimes the word after, and what they were talking about. I heard the word wool when they were talking about clothing. But the point is, when you first learn a word, research is pretty clear that actually a word out of context, less is more. And in the book, I talk about this, some of the research, less is more. Less information up front is actually better in some ways initially. But you can't if you want to use the word, you'll never use the word if you don't have it in a chunk, a sort of a prefabricated chunk. So wool, for example, cotton. Cotton is usually, I think, a cotton t-shirt or made of cotton. That's the phrase. And so when I learned the word algodón in Spanish, I want to learn hecho de algodón, or hecho con, made with cotton. That's what I want to learn, because that's the chunk when someone speaks Spanish that I'm most likely to hear, perhaps. So context is important, yes.
So this is great. And we have so many, we could speak about vocabulary forever, right, Keith?
I would. So just go ahead and stop me, please.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you, because you did end up with 7 suggestions, but your title is 3 ideas, and so one of the things might be good is just to hammer through. What are the 3 ideas that you want people to leave with?
Right. So the 3 things we talked about today was from the book. It was numbers 3, 4, and 7. So the first one I talked about today was the idea of when you use a list. You have a list that has 500 items or 100 items. Don't give students the whole list, right? And if your students take a whole list, help them understand that learning the list from A to Z is not the purpose. The second thing is that within that list, you go through and help students figure out a smaller list. So if you want to practice this list in class, choose 12 items. 12 is a good number. 15, 10, 8, whatever your magic number is going to be based on your time that you have in class. Pick that number and choose 7, 8, 10, 12 words. Make the words look as different from each other as possible and sound as different from each other as possible to help students be able to learn those words more easily, right? And the third thing we said was how to practice these words. And one idea was, if you imagine that your stack of 50 words or 20 words, if you had 20 little note cards, right? So you actually have these 20 cards, then what I would do is say, take these cards, stare at the card, and ask yourself, is it a word I know, I kind of know, or I have no idea? And test yourself. On the back, have something about the word, see if you got it right or not. And then when you finish, start with the words you kind of know. Start with the words you don't know. But as someone said about recycle,
Thank you. That is really awesome. I hate to have you stop because I think we could just sit here and listen for a long time, right, everybody? But we're going to give you, first of all, accolades. Thank you very, very much for, first of all, participating as our speaker here at our first virtual conference, and for closing out our session here. We're very, very grateful to you, and we want to give people maybe just a couple moments to get a little break before we come back with our president, Susan Gare, at 2 o'clock. Thank you so very, very much.
Thanks, Marcia. Good one. Okay.